In Appalachia, they discovered the survivors of the Hollow Colony. What was revealed by their testimony was the impossible. A group of hikers stumbled upon what authorities would later call the most disturbing case of familial isolation in American history, deep in the forest mountains of West Virginia, where fog clings to valleys like secrets refusing to fade. The outside world finally broke through the curtain that had hidden the Whitlock family for over 6 generations in the autumn of 1987. It happened on a cold October morning. What they described as children's voices echoing through the dense woodland was heard by 3 college students from Charleston, hiking the unmarked trails near the abandoned coal mining town of Hollow Creek. Emerging into a clearing, they followed the sound, where time seemed to have stopped somewhere in the previous century. A semicircle around a central fire pit still smoldering with embers was formed by 12 wooden structures barely standing. They froze, the students, when they saw them. 17 human beings, ranging from infants to elderly, all bearing the unmistakable physical markers of generations of interbreeding within the same bloodline. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. You won't want to miss our exclusive investigations into America's darkest family secrets that mainstream media refuses to cover. Hit subscribe now to join our community of truth seekers. At the entrance of the largest cabin stood the Whitlock patriarch, 72-year-old Ezekiel. The characteristic features that would become tragically familiar to medical professionals in the following weeks showed on his face. A severely protruding jaw, eyes set unusually far apart, hands with fused fingers, and a pronounced curvature of the spine that forced him to walk hunched forward. Others emerged behind him, each displaying varying degrees of physical abnormalities that told the story of what happens when family trees refuse to branch. To authorities, Sarah Mitchell, one of the hikers, later testified that the moment she made eye contact with Ezekiel, she understood they had discovered something that should have remained buried. His eyes, she recalled during the investigation, weren't asking for help. They were asking us to leave them alone, to pretend we never saw what we saw. But into their memories had already burned itself the image of children with twisted limbs playing in the dirt, of teenagers who could barely communicate beyond grunts and gestures, of a baby crying in the arms of its mother, who was also its sister. Within hours arrived the county sheriff, Thomas Bradshaw, accompanied by social services and medical personnel. Hundreds of pages of reports that state officials tried desperately to keep sealed would be filled by what they documented over the next 3 days. Since the 1880s, the Whitlock family had lived in complete isolation, when the original Whitlock brothers, Jacob and Matthias, fleeing from legal troubles in Virginia, had established their settlement deep in the Appalachian wilderness. What started as 2 brothers and their wives had devolved into a closed genetic loop where cousins married cousins, uncles took nieces as partners, and the concept of seeking relationships outside the family was considered betrayal of the bloodline. In the makeshift medical tent erected at the site stood Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the geneticist brought in to examine the family, and she felt her professional composure crack. Before her were 17 living examples of what happens when human DNA is forced to repeat itself across generations with minimal variation. With his heart on the wrong side of his chest and club feet that had never been treated had been born the youngest child, 3-year-old Nathan. Just 19 years old was his mother, Rebecca, the daughter of her own grandfather, a reality that showed in every feature of her face, the same protruding brow, the same weak chin, the same clouded left eye that half the family shared. Even the most experienced social workers were shocked by the living conditions. On what they hunted, foraged, and grew in small garden patches survived the family. They had no electricity, no running water, no contact with the outside world for over a century. Handmade from animal skins and old fabric repaired so many times it was impossible to determine its original form was their clothing. Dated back to the 1890s were books found in the main cabin, suggesting that formal education had stopped shortly after the colony's founding, but the physical isolation was nothing compared to the genetic isolation. Dr. Warren's preliminary examinations revealed that every member of the Whitlock family could trace their ancestry back to just 4 individuals, the 2 original brothers and their 2 wives. Through systematic interbreeding had the family maintained itself for 5 generations, with fathers claiming daughters, brothers sharing sisters, and the resulting children continuing the pattern. The family tree, when finally reconstructed, looked less like a tree and more like a tangled knot where branches looped back on themselves in ways that violated every natural law of genetic diversity. Through broken English that mixed archaic Appalachian dialect with words that seemed invented by the family itself, Ezekiel tried to explain their way of life to the authorities. "We keep the blood pure," he insisted, his twisted hands gesturing emphatically. "The old ways, the true ways. My grandfather taught my father. My father taught me. We don't mix with outsiders. Outsiders bring corruption, bring weakness. We stay strong by staying together." Reflected within the colony's borders, his logic, warped by generations of isolation and justification, reflected a belief system that had calcified into absolute truth. Horrors that would haunt the healthcare workers for years were revealed by the medical examinations. Of the 17 family members, only 4 had anything approaching normal cognitive function. Ranging from mildly delayed to profoundly impaired were the others, their minds as twisted by genetic repetition as their bodies. Signs of severe developmental disabilities were shown by 6 children under the age of 10. 2 teenagers were deaf. 1 elderly woman had never learned to speak at all, communicating only through gestures that only other family members seemed to understand. That for every child who survived to adulthood, 3 or 4 died before their first birthday was suggested by the infant mortality rate based on crude grave markers found in a cemetery behind the cabins. Because the stories we uncover here are the ones the world tried to forget. The truths hidden in shadows that will change how you see everything. 3 full days took the removal of the Whitlock family from Hollow Creek. With extreme caution had social services to proceed, as several family members became violent when authorities attempted to separate them. Her deformed child was clutched by Rebecca, the 19-year-old mother, and she screamed in a language that was neither English nor any recognized dialect, just the evolved speech pattern of a family that had talked only to itself for 100 years. Physically restrained had to be Ezekiel when workers tried to take the youngest children, his strength surprising for a man whose body appeared so broken. To a specialized medical facility in Charleston they were transported, where teams of doctors, psychologists, and social workers began the overwhelming task of understanding what had happened in those mountains. A family history so disturbing that senior officials debated whether the full truth should ever be made public was revealed by the interviews conducted over weeks. Through hours of patient questioning using simple language and visual aids, from the fog of time and secrecy began to emerge the story of the Hollow Colony. With Jacob and Matthias Whitlock, wanted men fleeing from charges of robbery in Richmond, Virginia in 1881, started the narrative. Their wives Mary and Ruth had been taken by them, and they disappeared into the Appalachian wilderness, settling in a valley so remote that even local hunters avoided it. Normally enough proceeded life for the first generation. Jacob was born 5 children by Mary. 6 gave Matthias by Ruth. But isolated from any other potential partners, when those children came of age, the genetic trap began to close. His cousin Elizabeth, Matthias's eldest daughter, was married by Thomas Whitlock, Jacob's eldest son, in 1903. 7 children were produced by their union, 3 of whom died in infancy from causes the family couldn't explain. The first signs of what would become the family's defining characteristics, unusual facial structures, joint problems, and learning difficulties, were shown by the survivors. But as warning signs, instead of recognizing these, the family interpreted them as marks of their special bloodline, proof of their separation from the corrupt outside world. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Systematized had the practice become by the 3rd generation. Both his sister Hannah and his cousin Grace were taken as partners by Michael Whitlock, Thomas's son, an arrangement the family accepted as normal. Increasingly severe abnormalities were shown by their children, twisted spines, fused digits, facial deformities that made eating difficult. Only 3 days lived one child born in 1925, his internal organs so malformed that he couldn't survive outside the womb. In the cemetery they buried him, and continued their isolated existence, convinced that their way of life was ordained by a higher purpose. Across from 40-year-old Daniel Whitlock sat Dr. Margaret Chen, the psychologist assigned to interview the family members capable of communication, and listened to him describe his childhood with a mixture of professional detachment and personal horror. Daniel, whose mother was also his aunt, and whose father was his mother's brother, spoke slowly, his speech impaired by a cleft palate that had never been repaired. "We were taught from the first breath," he explained, his words slurred but comprehensible, "that we are special, that our family is chosen, that mixing our blood with outsiders would destroy what makes us pure." A twisted theology that justified their practices was revealed by the family's belief system, reconstructed from interviews and the few written documents found in the settlement. Descendants of a sacred bloodline that had to be preserved at all costs was what they believed themselves to be. As contaminated were outsiders viewed. Their genes were viewed as capable of polluting the Whitlock purity. Not just accepted was marriage within the family. It was mandated. A traitor to their heritage, their ancestors, their very identity was considered anyone who questioned this. With each generation repeated the pattern, the genetic pool shrinking until it was little more than a puddle reflecting the same distorted image back at itself. Universal were physical deformities by the fifth generation, represented by Ezekiel and his siblings. The product of his father marrying his own daughter from a previous union was Ezekiel himself. A relationship that produced children with such severe abnormalities that only 3 of 8 survived past infancy. Rebekah's mother, Catherine, who died giving birth to Rebekah at age 32, was one of those survivors. Unable to sustain the pregnancy was her weakened body. A picture of suffering that spanned generations was painted by the medical reports. Universal among adults was chronic pain from malformed joints and bones. Severe were dental problems, with many family members missing most of their teeth by their 20s. Almost everyone was affected by vision problems, hearing impairments, and speech difficulties. Heart defects that would have been fatal without modern medicine were had by several family members. Developmental delays that ranged from mild to profound were shown by the children. Their brains were affected by the same genetic repetition that twisted their bodies. What physical examination had suggested was confirmed by Dr. Warren's genetic analysis conducted using blood samples from all 17 family members. Equivalent to that of identical twins was the effective genetic diversity of the Whitlock family. Their gene pool had been reduced to such an extent by 100 years of interbreeding that they were, genetically speaking, almost the same person repeated 17 times with minor variations. Higher than had ever been documented in a human population outside of deliberate medical research was the coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of genetic similarity. The most heartbreaking proved the interviews with the younger family members. In the interview room at the Child Psychology Center sat 10-year-old James Whitlock, whose father was also his grandfather, and drew pictures with his twisted hands. The forest, the cabins, the fire pit where the family gathered was what he drew. A woman with a distorted face was drawn by him when asked about his mother, then carefully a line connecting her to a man labeled Papa Grandpa. A family structure that defied normal description was what his child's mind was trying to make sense of. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. Through one-way glass, as James struggled to answer simple questions about his life, watched Sarah Foster, the child welfare specialist assigned to the case. "Who taught you to read?" she asked gently. Confused looked James. Something only Ezekiel could do was reading, and even he struggled with anything beyond the family Bible and the old books in the main cabin. Names, all cousins who were also siblings or half-siblings, children who shared so much genetic material that distinguishing relationships became meaningless, were listed by James when asked who he played with. From 15-year-old Martha Whitlock came the testimony that broke through the clinical detachment. Despite being born deaf in one ear and with a twisted spine that gave her constant pain, Martha had somehow maintained a sharp intelligence that manifested in her questions about the world beyond the colony. Like all the children, she had been taught that the outside world was evil, dangerous, corrupted. But an old magazine from 1965, blown into the colony by some long-ago storm, had also been found by her, and its pictures of cities and cars and people who looked different from her family had planted seeds of doubt. Through a combination of writing and gestures, the day she asked her mother why they all looked the way they did was described by Martha. Across the face had Martha been struck by her mother, Patricia, and told never to question the family's ways again. But I kept questioning, Martha wrote on the notepad provided by psychologists. In my head, where no one could punish me, I kept asking why our babies died so often, why everyone hurt all the time, why we couldn't talk right or see right or walk right. When Martha described the family's approach to relationships and reproduction came the revelation that shook investigators. By male relatives were girls typically claimed when they reached their early teens, sometimes younger. Didn't exist the concept of choice. By the patriarch based on what he believed would strengthen the bloodline were relationships determined. To her uncle Daniel since she was 12 had Martha herself been promised, an arrangement she had accepted as inevitable until the hikers appeared and the world she knew began to collapse. At this point, leave a comment with the phrase that Martha herself wrote when she first understood her freedom, I am not just Whitlock blood. I am a person who deserves choice. If her words move you, share them below. Behaviors that suggested years of normalized horror were documented by Dr. Lisa Thompson, the trauma specialist working with the younger family members. As a common occurrence, something sad but expected, was described by children watching newborns die within hours of birth. They spoke of relatives who couldn't feed themselves, couldn't control their bodily functions, couldn't understand simple instructions, all cared for by the family, but never questioned as to why they existed in such states. His baby sister being born blue and silent, then buried behind the cabins the same day, was described by one 8-year-old boy, Peter, his tone suggesting this was as normal as describing the weather. Damage that would affect them for life was revealed by the physical examinations of the children, malformed bone structures that would require multiple surgeries to partially correct, organ abnormalities that would need ongoing monitoring, neurological damage that no amount of therapy could fully address. At least 15 operations just to give him a chance at basic mobility and normal organ function were faced by the 3-year-old Nathan. When told this, wept his mother, Rebecca, not from grief but from confusion, unable to understand why doctors were so concerned about conditions she considered normal. As weeks turned to months, through patient interviews, genetic testing, and archaeological examination of the settlement site emerged the full scope of the Hollow Colony's history. Containing the remains of at least 47 individuals, mostly infants and children, who died before age 5 were burial grounds discovered by researchers. A story of infant mortality that approached 60% in some generations was told by the grave markers, crude wooden crosses with names and dates. Severe genetic abnormalities, fused skulls, missing or extra ribs, spinal deformities incompatible with life, were confirmed by forensic examination of accessible remains. Facing the reality that his family would never return to their mountain settlement, Ezekiel began to speak more freely with Dr. Harold Morrison, the anthropologist assigned to document the colony's history. A portrait of a man who genuinely believed he had been protecting his family, preserving something sacred, maintaining a tradition handed down from his grandfather was what emerged. The teaching passed from patriarch to patriarch, that the Whitlock blood was special, chosen, and that diluting it with outsider blood would destroy their family's essence, was described by him. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel. My grandfather showed me the old book, Ezekiel said, referring to a journal kept by Jacob Whitlock himself. It said we fled from a world of sin and corruption. That we were chosen to remain pure. That our children, even when they were born different, were blessed with the mark of our separation from the fallen world. That what started as a criminal's justification for isolation had evolved into a multi-generational delusion that condemned dozens of children to lives of suffering was revealed by the journal, now in the possession of state archives. Though released only in sanitized form, from 45-year-old David Whitlock, Ezekiel's younger brother, came the confession that made headlines. David, whose severe physical deformities had confined him to a wheelchair once modern medical equipment became available, described the systematic approach to maintaining the bloodline. To male relatives based on the patriarch's decision were girls assigned when they reached reproductive age. Not tolerated was refusal. To produce as many children as possible despite the high mortality rate, to ensure the family's continuation, was the goal. I questioned it once, David told investigators, his voice rough from a partially collapsed trachea, another genetic consequence of generations of inbreeding. I was 17. I saw my sister-wife give birth to our third child and he lived only 2 hours. His face was all wrong, twisted. He couldn't breathe right. I asked Ezekiel why God would do this to us. He beat me unconscious and told me never to question the family's ways again. After that, I stopped asking. A family trapped in a cycle of justified suffering was revealed by the psychological evaluations. For everything had they developed explanations. God's way of taking the weakest was high infant mortality. Marks of their special status were physical deformities. Protection from the corrupting influence of complex thoughts were cognitive impairments. Endurance was pain. Purification was suffering. Safety was isolation. So deeply ingrained was the mental framework that allowed them to continue their practices despite obvious harm that even when confronted with evidence of genetic damage, many family members clung to their beliefs. In a family therapy session sat Rebecca, the young mother whose child faced years of medical intervention, and struggled to understand why doctors called her son's condition a problem. But everyone looks like this, she insisted, gesturing to her own distorted features. This is how Whitlocks look. This is our family face. Simply wouldn't penetrate the worldview she had been taught since birth, the concept that her son's heart being on the wrong side of his chest, his club feet, his underdeveloped lungs, were preventable consequences of her parentage, not inevitable family traits. By the fact that many family members couldn't fully comprehend the charges against them were complicated the legal proceedings that followed. How do you prosecute people for practices they genuinely believed were right, mandated by tradition and theology? How do you explain laws about appropriate relationships to people who had never been taught those laws existed? Ultimately, against Ezekiel and 2 other male family members for various offenses were filed criminal charges, but the sentences were light, focused more on ensuring the family could never return to their isolated existence than on punishment. In specialized foster care programs with handlers trained in dealing with severe developmental and physical challenges were placed the children. To help them understand a world beyond the mountain colony was the goal. To teach them that their physical conditions were not marks of divine favor, but preventable tragedies, to give them choice in their lives for the first time. Slow was progress. Fastest adapted Martha, the teenager who had dared to question, eventually writing a memoir about her experience that would be published years later. Others struggled, some never fully adjusting to a world that seemed impossibly large and confusing after a lifetime in the forest. A landmark in the study of genetic isolation and its consequences became the Hollow Colony case. Dozens of papers analyzing the Whitlock family's genetic profile, using their case to educate new generations of doctors about the importance of genetic diversity, were published by medical journals. Using the Whitlocks as a cautionary example of what happens when human communities close themselves off completely from outside genetic input, programs studying isolated populations were developed by universities. But incalculable remained the human cost beyond the scientific legacy. By 1995, 8 years after the discovery, 5 of the original 17 family members had died. 2 damaged by genetic abnormalities to survive even with modern medical care were their bodies. In her sleep at a care facility passed away the elderly woman who had never learned to speak, having never understood why she had been taken from her mountain home. From complications related to their birth defects died 2 of the children, their bodies unable to overcome the genetic deck stacked against them from conception. A lifetime of challenges was faced by the survivors. 19 operations by age 12 were undergone by Nathan, the 3-year-old found clutching his mother in that mountain clearing. To walk with braces, to speak with a speech therapist's constant help, to navigate a world his body was never designed for was learned by him. In a group home for adults with developmental disabilities was placed his mother, Rebecca, visiting him when allowed, still not fully grasping that the practices that created his suffering were wrong, still believing somewhere deep in her damaged mind that the old ways were the true ways. The family's most public voice became Martha Whitlock, the girl who dared to question. Published when she was 25, her memoir detailed life in the colony with unflinching honesty. About watching her baby brother die hours after birth she wrote, about being told she would marry her uncle, about the constant pain from her twisted spine that she was taught to accept as normal, about the day the hikers appeared and her entire world collapsed and rebuilt simultaneously. Required reading in genetic counseling programs became the book, a first-hand account of inbreeding's human cost. For the rest of her career continued studying their case Dr. Warren, the geneticist who first examined the family. A comprehensive genetic analysis was published by her, showing exactly how the Whitlock family's DNA had degraded over 5 generations of interbreeding. Family trees that looked like knots, genetic markers that appeared with impossible frequency, and calculations showing that by the 6th generation, the family had less genetic diversity than many deliberately inbred laboratory mouse populations were included in the study. In 2003, 16 years after the discovery, passed away the last of the original colony's adults. In a nursing home died Ezekiel Whitlock, still maintaining that he had done right by his family, that he had preserved the bloodline as his grandfather had taught him. Over his grave stood Martha Whitlock at his funeral, attended only by a few social workers and the researcher who had documented his testimony, and spoke the words she had waited years to say, "You were taught wrong and you taught wrong and we all suffered for it. May the chain be finally broken." Eventually cleared by the state was the site of the Hollow Colony. Demolished were the cabins, properly marked and maintained was the cemetery. With restricted access was designated the land as a historical site. Not celebrating the family, but memorializing the children who died, there was erected a small monument. Victims of beliefs that valued tradition over health, purity over life, isolation over connection. Simply reads the inscription, "Here stood a community that forgot the truth." Diversity is not weakness but strength, and isolation leads only to decay. Mixed fates as adults were faced by the youngest survivors, children when they were discovered. Some, like Peter, adapted reasonably well to life outside the colony, finding community in disability support groups and building lives as far removed from their origins as possible. Constantly struggled others, their physical and cognitive limitations combined with profound psychological damage making independent life impossible. In a supervised setting chose to live together too, finding comfort in the only people who truly understood what they had survived. If you've watched until this point, one of the darkest chapters of hidden American history have you witnessed, because these stories of forbidden truths need to be told, remembered, and learned from. Leave a comment saying, "I watched until here, so I can know who truly appreciates these stories." If this testimony moved you, hit the like button. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that the most horrifying stories aren't fiction, but the secrets hidden in our own history. Beyond the Whitlock family themselves extends the legacy of the Hollow Colony. New laws regarding isolated communities, mandatory reporting requirements for medical professionals who suspect genetic abuse, and educational programs about the dangers of closed populations were prompted by the case. Offering free consultations to communities at risk of similar patterns expanded genetic counseling services. A teaching tool used to explain why human genetic diversity isn't just scientifically beneficial but morally necessary became the case. From their early 20s to late 40s range in age the surviving Whitlock family members today. Changed to protect their privacy are the names they carry. Altered by what modern surgery could accomplish are their faces, but genetics that forever mark them as survivors of one of America's most disturbing examples of familial isolation. Scattered across the country they live, some maintaining contact with each other, others preferring to leave their shared past buried in those Appalachian mountains where their ancestors chose to hide from the world. An eternal reminder that isolation breeds suffering, that closed systems inevitably decay, and that the human cost of refusing to connect with the broader world is measured in graves of children who never had a chance, in bodies twisted by repeated genetic patterns, in minds damaged by beliefs that valued abstract purity over concrete well-being serves the story of the Hollow Colony. In Appalachia, they found the survivors of the Hollow Colony, and their testimony revealed not the impossible, but the terrible truth of what happens when families become prisons and bloodlines become chains.